after a period of relative peace, or détente if you're cool and know French, the Soviet Union invades the desert nation of Afghanistan. In retaliation, the United States leads a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and arms the local Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen. Although they've managed to avoid open war, these super rivals continue to amass nuclear weapons capable of eradicating their enemy and the world with it. But a new weapon is on the horizon that could bring balance to the force. Ideologically, the Cold War divides the world more harshly than The Last Jedi divided Star Wars fans.
The White House says the U.S. will keep plugging away for agreements on limiting nuclear arms, no matter what the Kremlin does.
This whole period was a bit like that scene where Kylo Ren and Rey are reaching for a lightsaber. Everyone was just hoping not to get blown up.
When we think about the Cold War, we think about the Iron Curtain, we think about the Berlin Wall, and we think about two rival alliances that faced off, East and West. That was a critical dynamic that shaped so much of the way the Cold War unfolded in Europe. And in the early 1980s, you increasingly have everyday people worried that war might again be possible as an arms race begins to take on new dynamics, particularly with the introduction of new missiles on both sides of the Iron Curtain that could destroy the continent.
There's a realization in both capitals, in Washington and in Moscow, that you can't really have direct military confrontation with the other power because it could mean the end of humanity. And yet, at the same time, I think the Cold War is a kind of zero-sum game, meaning that a benefit for one side is automatically a corresponding loss for the other side. In a sense, the whole world was now part of this game. So what do? Well, the answer is proxy wars. It allows you to use ideological allies to wage a kind of indirect struggle against the other side.
As these two rival blocs continue to fight proxy wars and build up their nuclear arsenals, an idea is born that has the potential to end the Cold War by eliminating nuclear weapons entirely. It's 1979, and despite arms limitation talks, more nuclear weapons exist in the world than ever before.
By the late 1970s and early 1980s, there are an extraordinary amount of nuclear weapons in the world. Between the two of them, around 45,000 nuclear weapons.
That's way more nuclear weapons than would be needed to destroy the planet. And for the first time in history, the Soviets have reached nuclear parity, which was really important to the strategic balance. Parity was like a ticket into the superpower club, occupancy 1.
The United States looked out at the world and saw the Soviet Union on the rise, taking advantage of America's retreat after the Vietnam War, spreading its power and influence in the Third World, cultivating ally in Nicaragua, and then invading Afghanistan in 1979. Whereas the United States felt it was on the decline.
America was looking for a change, a leader who would make them feel big and strong again. Somebody handsome, like a movie star. Someone who was so into Law and Order that they literally starred in the movie. In 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected in a landslide.
Starring Ronald Reagan as Frame Johnson.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it.
This former actor-turned-politician was able to unite Christian conservatives, working-class whites, rich people who hate paying taxes, and war hawks who want more aggressive foreign policy in the name of beating the USSR. And just like the characters he played in westerns such as Cattle Queen of Montana, Reagan comes out with guns blazing.
We think about some of the greatest hits, most quoted Reagan pieces. We think about him condemning the Soviet Union as an evil empire, him talking before the British Parliament about leaving communism on the ash heap of history. He wasn't delicately stepping around a dislike or a distaste for the Soviet system, for communism as an ideology. He was willing to go out and talk about how much he didn't like it.
To make America great again.
Instead of trying to de-escalate, as his predecessors had done through containment, Reagan decided to escalate things.
The combination of Reagan's big, bold rhetoric and his willingness to spend a lot of money on new weaponry was really part of the Reagan persona of the early 1980s, something that left a lot of people terrified about what the president might be willing to do.
At the same time, Reagan would say seemingly contradictory things, like he wanted to eliminate all nuclear missiles.
Last year, on November 18th, I proposed the total global elimination of all these missiles. I proposed that the United States would deploy no comparable missiles, which are scheduled for late 1983, if the Soviet Union would dismantle theirs.
Well, I was alarmed by Reagan, both because of what he was saying and doing, but also because he didn't seem very deep. He didn't seem very well informed. He seemed to think and speak in cliches.
And leave us wiser than we were.
One of the most puzzling pieces of Reagan's plan was a program he introduces in 1983.
We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, or what some people called, and I'm not making this up, the Star Wars program.
That moniker really reflected how wild, in many respects, the scheme was. So people made fun of the president for this idea, thought it was completely impossible, just a wild boondoggle that was going to cost too much money and never yield anything.
But once Reagan believed in something, he wanted results, even if most people thought it wasn't possible, like Yoda in Empire.
All right, I'll give it a try.
No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try.
For Reagan personally, it came from a deep sense of discomfort with what nuclear strategy expected the president to do.
Reagan hated the idea of mutually assured destruction.
Turns out Reagan was a secret nuclear abolitionist, which anyone who remembers those years will find astonishing. As he told one of his aides on the way to the nominating convention, who asked him what was his main goal as president, he said to get rid of nuclear weapons, which again astonished his aide.
Reagan wanted to see a world without nuclear weapons. And something like the Strategic Defense Initiative, he saw as a way to make that nuclear-free world possible.
Here's the plan. Create a kind of impenetrable shield with a combination of armed satellites and ground-based weapons that could literally shoot nuclear missiles out of the sky with lasers.
The way Reagan presented the Strategic Defense Initiative made the Soviets really scared. And it was very difficult for Reagan to understand why the Soviets are scared. Because Reagan said, look, once we build this shield, we're not going to attack anybody. It's just defensive. In the Soviet psychology, there's still the shock of World War II, right? The attack by Hitler that they did not anticipate. Except that this time it's a blitzkrieg from space. And that's how they saw it.
The Soviets decided that they need to investigate whether the Star Wars program would work. But this time, they didn't have any spies embedded in the program. Top Soviet scientists determined two things. One, lasers in space would be dangerous if the Americans managed to pull it off. And two, given existing technology, it's impossible. So what did the Soviets do? Instead of trying to build their own version of the Star Wars program, which they knew would not work, they decided to simply build more nuclear weapons, a lot of them. And they make them more sophisticated and more dangerous.
A huge part of the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union is one for hearts and minds. Right? Trying to convince everyday people, regular citizens, that whichever superpower is not the one responsible for the tensions of the Cold War.
But across the world, regular people had been advocating for nuclear disarmament for years. And their voices only get louder as the arms race continues. Protesters take to the streets. Parents call their representatives. Even children get involved, like a young girl named Samantha Smith.
So Samantha Smith was a young girl, 10 years old, and she worried about the dangers of nuclear war, writes to the Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov, expressing her concerns about nuclear war and urging him to do what he can to stop nuclear war from taking place.
And Yuri responds.
And the Kremlin was incredibly savvy. They seize on this letter and actually invite her to visit the Soviet Union.
Samantha Smith becomes a household name in both countries.
Would you welcome Samantha Smith?
And it might be because Samantha's feel-good story provides hope. But she might be the only hope. Because a few months later, something happens that turns up the heat again.
In September of 1983, the Soviet Air Defense Forces shot down a passenger aircraft, Korean Airlines Flight 007. Every passenger, all 269 of them on board the plane, were killed as a result of this, including a US congressman. And this really hammered home to people just how easily a mistake might lead to war or, God forbid, nuclear war.
1983 was also the year the United States was preparing to start deploying the Pershings and cruise missiles in Europe. It used to be that the strategic missiles from the United States would take about half an hour to reach the Soviet Union. Now, with Pershings and the cruise missiles in Europe, the flight time is less than 10 minutes. Therefore, there's not enough time to make decisions. There's not enough time for people to go to nuclear shelters. I felt for the first time that nuclear war became possible.
Just a few weeks after the Korean flight is shot down, a Soviet military officer named Stanislav Petrov is working at a command center responsible for detecting nuclear attacks against the Soviet Union. Shortly after midnight, his system detects 5 missiles heading for the Soviet Union from the United States.
And according to orders, he was expected to report that up the chain to begin the authorization for a retaliatory strike. Now, thankfully, Stanislav Petrov concluded that it had to be a computer error because the United States would never start a nuclear war with only 5 missiles. He defied his orders and didn't report this. But if he had, we would have been looking at a very different situation.
In the midst of this tension, the US and its allies sense they must prepare for the worst. They run a realistic military exercise across Europe, simulating a coordinated nuclear attack.
In the sort of mythology about how dangerous the Cold War was in 1983 in particular, one episode looms over all of them, and that's a NATO exercise which was known by the codename Able Archer.
As Soviet intelligence is trying desperately to detect the early signs of a nuclear attack, NATO seems to be simulating one.
In the immediate aftermath of the exercise, intelligence signals came in that suggested to Western officials that the Soviet Union had thought that NATO might use this exercise as a cover to start a nuclear war, and that they had contemplated launching a retaliatory strike of their own based on this assessment.
At this point, Soviet and American leaders hadn't met since the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. But there's a new leader in Moscow, and Reagan hopes to meet him. Mikhail Gorbachev.
I think the main thing to be said about Gorbachev is that he was a remarkably emancipated man. He understood there were things that were terribly wrong about the Soviet system, and he wanted to reform it. And furthermore, he was an optimist.
Reagan and Gorbachev meet for the first time in a summit in Geneva in 1985. And although it did not accomplish anything concrete, it did have at least one positive outcome. Reagan and Gorbachev sincerely enjoyed one another.
There was one vignette at Geneva, which I've always remembered. Their advisors were in another room, and the two of them were sitting on a couch, chatting. And one of the advisors came in and said, Mr. President and Mr. Chairman, time to resume the meeting. And Reagan says, wait a minute, Michael and I are having a great time chatting. And I think it had something to do with the fact that they resembled each other in some very important ways. Both men were from small, rural communities. Both men adored one of their parents, but not the other. Both of them were optimistic by nature. It was even the case that their marriages resembled each other.
It's like the episode of Seinfeld where the gang meets their doppelgangers.
So there were all of these parallels, and you may want to dismiss this and say, well, that's just, that's background, that's not important. But I think it predisposed them to think that they could get along and reach agreement.
In Geneva, both leaders learned something surprising about one another. Each was sincerely interested in limiting, if not eliminating, nuclear weapons from the globe. They plan to hold their next summit 2 years later in Washington. But before they meet, Gorbachev has a traumatic experience that cements things in his mind even further. In 1986, an explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant results in the worst nuclear disaster in history.
So Gorbachev was an abolitionist even before Chernobyl, but after Chernobyl, he was so committed. He was really developed this abhorrence of nuclear weapons after Chernobyl.
Reagan also hated nuclear weapons, but he didn't want to give them up blindly, and he didn't trust that a treaty would be enough to guarantee the safety of the American people. He wanted a backup plan, a technological guarantee. And for Reagan, that guarantee was his precious Star Wars program, SDI.
And the two men arrived in Reykjavik with these very different perspectives on what they were going to do. And yet, surprisingly, shockingly, astonishingly, both men really did believe that it was possible to eliminate nuclear arsenals in the world.
Things started poorly. After 2 days of debate, Gorbachev was frustrated because every time he brought up the idea of reducing nuclear arsenals, Reagan brought up the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Gorbachev kept saying, why are you doing this? This was going to ruin nuclear deterrence. Reagan kept saying, well, once we have them, we'll give them to you.
And Gorbachev said, come on, how can I trust you? You wouldn't even share the milking agricultural technology. And you are now saying you will share this very high, very secret military technology.
Eventually, Gorbachev got fed up.
And he stood up and said, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. This meeting is over. I'm going to go back to Moscow and say we failed. It really was a near miss for him.
But a few days later, they were able to make some headway.
Gorbachev and Reagan were discussing getting rid of the intermediate range ballistic missiles in Europe. And Reagan said, well, if we're going to get rid of all of those, why don't we just get rid of them all? Gorbachev was shocked. One can see him pulling back in his chair and saying, what do you mean all? And Reagan said, every damn last one of them, get rid of them all. And Gorbachev finally grasped what this man was saying and said, eagerly, we can do that. And they began discussing how they might begin the process of eliminating all the nuclear weapons in the world.
Then the president said, if we can commit to this, maybe 10 years from now, we'll meet again. Hello, Mikhail. Ron, is that you? And then we'll destroy the last missiles.
Gorbachev at that point said, Mr. President, I can see that happening, but you must first agree that you won't test your SDI program in space.
A switch must have gone off in Reagan's head because he got angrier than anyone had ever seen him. But that was it. Both leaders walked away from Reykjavik having almost agreed to eliminating nuclear weapons from the face of the world.
They were so close to agreeing on abolishing nuclear weapons, completely eliminating them, building a non-nuclear world. They were so close. And the SDI did not allow them to come to the agreement.
After around $30 billion spent in research and development into the Star Wars program's impenetrable shield, the United States never completed it successfully. Ironically, the technology that was meant to end the Cold War is the very thing that broke down negotiations to eliminate nuclear weapons.
I'm afraid of war, and I'm afraid of the weapons who will make a war possible.
I'm not only afraid of the Americans, but I'm afraid too of the Russians.
I am a human being who happens to care what happens to this earth and who happens to be very, very angry that the adults in power plan to ruin the earth and my future, and I intend to seize it into my own hands.
But not everyone was lamenting this breakdown in negotiations. Many were furious they went so far at all.
The leadership in Washington, Margaret Thatcher in England, she really took him to the cleaners. All were just horrified at how close Reagan had come to giving up the nuclear arsenals of the West.
Yeah, but are you still optimistic? Are you still optimistic?
Still, there were some who recognized Reykjavik for what it was, a turning point. After the meeting, Secretary of State George Shultz said, Mr. President, we made more progress at Reykjavik than I have seen in 25 years of negotiating with the Soviet Union. The world's nuclear stockpile reached its peak in 1986, the year of the Reykjavik summit. But in the 36 years since, the United States and Russia reduced their stockpiles by 84% and 89% respectively. And none of this would have happened without the friendship that Gorbachev and Reagan developed at Geneva and Reykjavik. The friendship helped them return to the negotiating table when they hit dead ends. It gave them hope. Gorbachev returned to Moscow perhaps frustrated but hopeful. With Reagan, he had seen over the horizon a world without nuclear weapons, without nuclear fallout. If they could get so close to eliminating nuclear weapons, what else could be achieved? Gorbachev had seen the terrifying results of nuclear fallout in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. The consequences of the disaster are compounded by the secrecy and corruption of the Soviet powers that be, failing to warn citizens about the dangers of radiation. While Gorbachev came to power intending to reform the Soviet system, he began to question whether the country was beyond repair. Under Gorbachev's leadership and his desire for reform and openness, something begins to shift behind the Iron Curtain. A month after Reagan leaves office in 1989, the Soviet Union officially withdraws from Afghanistan as a wave of revolutions begin to ripple throughout the Eastern Bloc.